Morning. Thank you, Pam. As Pam says, we're doing this as a tag team, so I'm going to start off by sort of providing an overview of the strategic growth across Fife, as well as the infrastructure that's required to support that level of growth, and then touch on the challenges that sort of inherently come from that level of growth. So if I start off with first slide, this slide gives you really indication of the level of strategic sites right the way across Fife. And looking at our last HLA, we've got something like 24,000 houses, 8,000 of which have planning permission, the remainder of which are within allocated sites spread across Fife. But for the purposes of my session this morning, I'm going to drill down and look at probably some of the most, or the biggest and most complex strategic site that we have within Fife, which is in Dunfermline. And this site itself comprises of a number of smaller sites, but overall is effectively 8,000 houses, 25% of which will be affordable units, which is therefore 2,000 units will be affordable as the sites build out themselves. But because of the scale and complexity of the number of different landowners and the spread of the sites across the settlement of Dunfermline, the council took a strategic decision back at the LDP preparation stage to lead on the two key elements of infrastructure the council will be responsible for. That's not to say that there's significant other investment required as well from the likes of Scottish Power, Scottish Water, NHS examples. So we continue to have those discussions to keep those key agencies involved and up to speed in terms of the delivery on the ground. But specifically in terms of education and transportation matters, the council decided it would be much more cohesive to take the lead in terms of identifying the infrastructure that's necessary in order to have a very efficient and clear plan set out in terms of how that infrastructure is required to come online to support the planned level of growth, specifically in Dunfermline. So just to give you an indication of the scale and complexity, 8,000 houses requires a significant amount of infrastructure to support that level of growth. And the slide on the screen at the moment shows the sites themselves complete with the infrastructure required within them, as well as the linkages between them and some of the off-site interventions that are required to mitigate that level of impact from that scale of development. The red dots, which if you can make out, are effectively the new schools that are required to support that level of growth. And the two key elements within that strategic transport assessment identified the Northern Link Road across the top of Dunfermline and a Western Distributor Road down the western side of Dunfermline to provide the necessary road capacity. And in terms of the fact that we have so many different sites, the council took the view that a strategic transport assessment would be the most efficient way to identify the cumulative impact across all these sites, and therefore distill from that what the most efficient intervention is in terms of actually mitigating that level of impact. So the council undertook that exercise, identified the intervention measures required, and crucially, I suppose, from the development industry's perspective, allowed us to estimate what the cost of those mitigation measures were. So as a developer bringing forward any one of these sites, you're able to look back in terms of the scale of impact, identify the mitigation measures required, and crucially, from a certainty perspective, identify the level of contributions that would be required to cumulatively mitigate the impact on a transportation basis. And the same applied from the schools perspective. So the number of schools identified within Dunfermline equates to 5 primary schools, and those were initially costed on the basis of an SFT metric, which roughly equated to around £50 million for just the 5 primary schools required in Dunfermline. There's also a secondary school equivalent in terms of capacity required within Dunfermline to support the growth. But initially, at the LDP stage, the estimated cost of the 5 new primary schools was around £50 million based on that metric. However, given that they required quite far in advance, we then apply indexation in order to ensure that the cost of those capital investments or infrastructure mitigation measures are fully funded by the developments on the sites themselves. And at the last estimate, that cost had gone from 50 million based on indexation alone to 63.8 million. But as most of you or some of you may be aware, the SFT metrics in the process of actually being updated, and our rough anecdotal assessment of that level of increase at the moment looks to increase that further to around 79.8 million for the 5 primary schools. So one of the big challenges in terms of the scale of growth is the fact that some of these mitigation measures are required quite far in advance. So it's really difficult to try and understand the timing and delivery, and especially the cost implications of trying to decide the level of infrastructure at this moment in time when something's required quite far down the line. So that leads neatly onto probably one of the key strands within MPF4, and as set out in draft policy 4, there's a strong focus on infrastructure first. And in terms of that sort of brief, quick summary in terms of the Dunfermline approach, Council have taken that approach to identify that there is a clear evidence base in terms of what's required for the transport mitigation, and likewise the school infrastructure that's required. So there's a clear linkage between impact and mitigation measures required, and equally leading on from that, it provides that clarity in terms of this is the scale of contributions that are required in order to mitigate that impact. And crucially, the element there that is also coming quite strongly through that policy is new infrastructure is particularly is the last level of requirement in terms of mitigating impact. It should be a case of trying to use existing infrastructure to mitigate or to reduce the need for additional infrastructure as you expand through development. But that leads us on neatly to a couple of key challenges that this kind of arises. And the three on those I'll focus on. And the first one relates to capacity. So the challenge we have is that through iterative development plans, allocated sites haven't been built out, any headroom within, especially both, I suppose, specifically education, but also on the road network, has been absorbed through iterative developments as these have been built out. So if a site is able to fit within a primary school in terms of capacity, there's no mitigation required, and that development therefore is allowed to proceed without any mitigation required to accommodate that development. It's not necessary, so that's fine. The problem that leads us to is when we get such significant strategic allocations that we try and deliver, we find that the first few houses really trigger quite a significant amount of infrastructure required to accommodate any further growth, because there is no headroom within existing school estates to accommodate pupils arising from development. And the same applies when it comes to the transportation network. Iterative, smaller, incremental improvements to infrastructure through smaller or medium-sized developments have almost exhausted the opportunities that existed on the road, and likewise in the school estate, to expand those existing infrastructure networks. But we're now at the point that there is no space within school estates. School grounds themselves have been utilised to provide previous classroom extensions, and therefore there's no option to really look at further extensions to schools. It's therefore unfortunately leading to the point that very early on, for quite significant, a small number of houses, you're required to provide quite a big infrastructure investment, whether it's roads related or education related. And probably one of the linkages, one of the other challenges I suppose we're finding is that we're finding access to actual materials and the supply of labour in terms of actually delivering some of these is becoming really challenging, and that'll be well understood probably across the audience here. And one of the things coincidentally we've discovered is that HS2 is having quite a significant impact in terms of the draw on both materials and labour to allow us to facilitate the construction of infrastructure projects up here. And it's having quite a marked impact. I believe one of the resources required for HS2 has been bought up by the project for the next 2 years, meaning that natural resource that's required for other infrastructure projects needs to be imported, which has an additional cost, and that ultimately affects the end line in terms of the mitigation costs that are required to be delivered. Similarly, in terms of the financial infrastructure, the significant infrastructure need in terms of finance as a real issue for cash flow. In particular, if you're talking, say, 1,500 house development, potentially needs a school early on, it's about 10, 12 million pound investment, and it might be needed as soon as 200-300 units of that development having been built out. And typically, the investment to deliver the infrastructure comes from the sale of those houses. So you're needing to invest quite a significant amount of money up front to allow the development to proceed beyond that barrier where the tipping point is reached in terms of education capacity. But the question then is, where's that front funding coming from? And that's becoming a real challenge, especially given the existing capacity on both those two infrastructure situations within the council. Section 75s, they always capture a decision made at a point in time. And I've touched earlier on about the fact that some of these mitigation measures are required quite far down the line. Some of our strategic development sites are of that scale that the permission is valid for 2 decades. So by the time you get to the latter phase of that development being built out, what you decided initially could well be very easily outdated, but there's a limited ability to revise that, especially if the costs have gone up. It's a challenge in terms of trying to meet that capital deficit if the specification potentially changes. I've got in there that we do index link our Section 75 contributions so that we're trying to alleviate that cost differential arising from inflation. But critically, if the specification changes, building regulations might change, or we move to a different set of requirements for a specification if the SFT metric changes. The if we build a school later on, but on the previous assessment and estimation having been done on a older or outdated specification for the estimates, then it creates another capital gap. And again, the question is, where do you find that shortfall in the capital funding? And lastly, I've touched on there in terms of appeals, our strategic transport appraisal approach for Dunfermline has quite a few developers already consented and signed up to providing their contributions for mitigating the cumulative impact. But we're currently facing a live appeal where one of the developments, or one of the strategic sites, is challenging our approach. And the question, still sitting with the reporters at the moment, but one of the questions is, if that appeal is successful, what does that do to the wider strategy for our strategic approach in terms of a cumulative mitigation measure for all the sites in Dunfermline? So that leads us neatly onto where we are. We might have a straightforward, simple plan to get from A to B, but the reality is, as that slide at the bottom shows, never as straightforward, as simple as that, which is hopefully what I've touched on in terms of some of those challenges we're facing. There's probably more questions in there than answers. But yeah, a few of those hurdles or ditches and voids to still be overcome, but we normally do find a way, but it is a challenge. So I'll leave you with that, but immediately pass on to Steve Iannarelli, who's, as Pam said, our strategic development manager, who's dealing with the applications for the strategic sites on the ground, and he'll focus specifically on the detail of St Andrews. So Steve.
Always, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. So trying to sort of tie down all those high-level assumptions into maybe site-based development, and how this works at a more sort of localised level is understanding that. I thought I'd take you through the strategic growth that's identified in St Andrews West. So this site is part of our strategic, it's identified and allocated in the LDP as a strategic development area. So ultimately trying to seek and realise the growth of the spatial strategy, the local development plan, with both regeneration, employment, university, open space, a real network of kind of uses there, and kind of, I suppose, probably the first development that's gone through major in St Andrews for years, if not decades, in terms of the scale and the context about this and how that sits. So I think looking at some of the background here, you can kind of see the variety of uses in terms of the sort of greys, the residential components, and sort of blue turquoise with the employment uses and the commercial, so actually, and the university related uses, and with a sort of central core in that sort of purple and pink area, and our new Madras College and sort of N3, the orange area there, I suppose set within a context of landscape framework and open spaces, and I'm really trying to understand connectivity here, where you see existing cycleways and routes and connective routes and core paths. So trying to understand this, is this a new place, a destination that sort of, I know there's a 20-minute neighbourhood agenda that's coming through this, all sort of strategic government policy that's coming through, and how does this sit? And I suppose the context here is this is before NPF4, this sits in a realm of how did government policy and the local development plan trying to frame some of these aspirations that NPF4 is seeking to take through. So there's development sort of planning permission principle for this site, and the first NSC applications have been going through for residential components in the centre of the site and care homes, and it seems to be that there's a sort of a tidy flow of I suppose development going through and ultimately looking through there. But there's also a site to the south which is another component for about another 350 dwellings. With another separate major house builder who's taking that forward. So there's a couple of components to how this strategic development area sits, with off-site transport contributions and linkages for infrastructure, and everybody playing their part, as Kevin mentioned, about sort of strategic transport assessments and understanding how they all play their part in actually trying to deliver the infrastructure associated with how the site comes forward. As part of that, looking at what does NPF4 say in terms of the sort of strategic objectives of sustainable places, and how does that sit within a site like this? Well, the context of what this is this development framework, as you would get maybe of all sites of this nature, but then what the sort of planning permission principle does is it drills down development briefs for each of the character areas that set the context at that time of how that design rationale, place-based, infrastructure-led, wherever it sits in terms of the context of that character area, that phase goes through with the layouts getting tested against that. So you can kind of see here, this is sort of civic square, or the aspirations for that, and how we're trying to maybe look at a brief that creates a sense of place. This is where the residential components overlap with commercial and the university employment area. So it's starting to look at, well, is this a hub starting to be created here? How does that sit with these aspirations there? When layouts come in and details come through, that there's a real priority. And I think must say that the consortium involved in this, I've looked at that from the start. This high quality urban design and place-based agenda, and how that sits is probably at the forefront of their priorities here. And there's been a kind of collaboration of how that sits in terms of being able to deliver this site with I suppose our hats on of making sure that the infrastructure sits right there. Then a lot of this design and things sort of translates through. With how does sort of policy 8 translate through and some of this? And I think what we've got is, as part of each of this, there's a strategic infrastructure delivery plan. So setting out overarching kind of infrastructure requirements for the site's delivery, but also sort of site specific or phase specific. Here you can kind of see one of the first phases in the sort of northeastern corner is what is that there? What is, you know, from all actions, we're not missing anything. We want to make sure that this is sitting here, and it's almost testing out that those high level ambitions that the NPF4 starts to take are sitting there, but it's about delivery, and I suppose it's understanding time scales when these are forward and what are the consequences of these components or different parts of infrastructure not being delivered. And I think that's something that this puts to the forefront of people's minds in terms of delivering sort of various phases and components as part of that. I think looking at, I suppose one of the key policies in NPF4 is that climate emergency is that there's a lot of kind of the decarbonisation agenda, sort of full life cycles of where buildings and developments are going to achieve that. Well, I suppose those are some of the new sort of items that are coming through of NPF4. But when we look at kind of what has been happening on this site, the district heating connection, those sort of government policies, and I suppose our own supplementary guidance to look through. This shows here sort of the university areas or the light green areas being kind of existing where a district heat network is going to be connected into. You can see to the sort of bottom of the side that the dark green colours of the existing university heat networks at the halls of residence and the new madrasas there. And the blue line sort of shows the safeguarded areas for future district heat network connections. I'm not sure if you can quite read it, but at the bottom left there is just this sort of wayleaves of making sure that actually, if we're going to put future pipe networks in, making sure that you've got the, I suppose, the width, the separation, the ability to achieve, you know, tree-lined avenues, utilities, verges, but also have the connection for the pipe network in there. So that's some of that's already started to kind of come forward, I suppose, as part of the planning permission and principle, and it's how that's achieved through the discharge petitions or the MSC applications that are starting to come forward gets tested at a time when NPF4 will be adopted or whenever the time goes up. So the policy agenda at that time will be looking through, well, what is it that was in the original planning permission and principle, and then how do these, I suppose, aspirations within the sort of each of those levels of the development briefs and design approach work through. With looking at pulled out some of the sort of other opportunities to say, you know, what is a sustainable transport opportunity? Yeah, how do we look through, you know, and look at the site holistically to connect into existing networks to the east and into the existing settlement. You see the sort of blue lines across there and some of the diagrams of how that might work about widening and making sure that we're creating avenues and opportunities for people to sort of ditch the car and actually enjoy that. But you know, sort of direct routes there you can kind of see is what happened in the sort of development framework here for this. But you can also see the kind of more leisurely routes along the north and the west through the open space, giving people an opportunity to have two different types of approach. And you can see the sort of the aspirations within the sort of the approach here have started to try and achieve that. So and you can kind of see how that maybe sits with some of the context across at the bottom there. So, again, there's also opportunities to see that this is that sort of harmony of uses in that mix of where does that sort of darker blue employment and university core sit with the sort of yellow residential components, and you know, in terms of the setting it's in there with its open space, maybe very different to what might have been a standard office complex or, you know, industrial area. So you start to see that it isn't just, you know, separation of uses. You start to see how this fits together as a place and as ultimately sort of parts of a neighbourhood, and you know, some of these productive, I suppose, economic development opportunities being sort of combined with a sense of space and understanding how that sits within that. It's also an idea of how do we deliver, you know, opportunities for blue and green infrastructure? How do we understand that these wider opportunities, you know, are not just left out and they're sort of designed in at the beginning. So the consortium here, we're looking through that. I've started to put these in, you know, sort of an early stage. So, you know, probably a lot more information is put up front of the planning permission and principle with the development frameworks that might have been much more brief, you know, in terms of the development side, so that you could just get that understanding of where they sit, and you know, you're designing your development blocks maybe around, you know, where we've got key arterial routes, interconnectivity between what is, I suppose, you know, ecological, but also open space and leisure, and I suppose and woodland and structure planting as you start to go around the edges of that site. So it's really sort of how that combination starts to sort of sit together. And I think sort of final opportunity is working through these, as I said, sort of the idea of a biodiversity enhancement and really making sure there's net gain and understanding that. And I suppose that's those corridors that I was talking about how do they sit and how is that being designed? And you can kind of see in the northwestern corner there about blocks being pushed back and pulled back, but for a variety of reasons. But ultimately, the priority has been sort of sitting here and ultimately understanding how that's an important component that relates to the future sites of development, which is probably got 20-year vision in terms of the sort of delivery timescales as part of this. Got a couple of key points that Kevin and I are going to summarise. I'll leave it to him to do the first couple.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so appreciate that. Probably a lot of information to try and absorb in the space of 20 minutes. So hopefully the caffeine's helped. But we'll stick in a few key points just to kind of summarise where we ended up with, sort of in terms of the presentation and things probably to take away and mull over. The first one I've got up there is the MPF2. I thought Salvador Dali clock neatly summarised where we are. It's like we need a timeline in terms of when this will be finalised. We have a draft policy document that's out, but there's no timeline in terms of when the finalised version will come out and how that then feeds into our emerging LDP2s and how we take that in terms of take that forward in terms of any emerging applications that come forward in the interim period. So we have a draft document with a clear direction in terms of what's in there at the moment. Will it stay like that? Will it change? And what's the timescale for that being finalised? Probably 2 of the 3 critical bits we need to move forward on that. I've stuck in there moving targets, probably to reflect the fact that some of the specifications that we're working to at the moment, we choose or make a decision at this point in time, but that doesn't hold true as you progress through the development, the life cycle of a development, especially for the bigger sites, which, as I said earlier on, could take 10, 20 years to build out. And I stuck in the reverse telescope effect, which, effectively tries to summarise that. Looking in the other end of a telescope, you get a much smaller view further down the line, as opposed to trying to find a clearer image down the line to try and assist that assessment in terms of what you're trying to plan for at this moment in time, knowing that you're bound by the terms of whatever you sign up to today and the future state. So I'll leave Steve to cover the last 3, but that's my summary.
Yeah, thanks Kevin for that. I think understanding that is really where it sits with, I suppose with permissions being in place, operator here that was really keen in making sure that priorities that are coming through as MPF4 have actually been put in already within frameworks and within briefs that are coming through. But actually, what you're doing is subsequent phases that are coming through are getting tested against an original planning permission in principle. So what are you looking at? You're actually looking at what are the parameters of documentation and information that's coming there, testing it against a new development plan that will be ultimately sitting there with MPF4, but with a willing developer and somebody on site that's willing to try and achieve some of these, there's much more ease. And I think what we're trying to work out the context of without that and the difficulties and the pushback that you might get with ultimately a legal document. This is one thing with ultimately priorities that are maybe not quite in matching, or we're trying to work out how that sits. Thankfully, it's probably not the case in this instance, but it can maybe it made us spots of thinking how that sits in between it. And then I suppose the way in which it's infrastructure first, the sustainability, argument of place of the importance of these strategic growth areas and the allocations. And Fife has quite a lot of strategic development areas allocated within the local development plan, and sort of understand that this is the really kind of key importance to be able to try and achieve sort of the infrastructure, minimising sort of new infrastructure, make sure that sustainability is sitting in there, and also the sort of place agenda in terms of making sure these new neighbourhoods are within proximity to the services and infrastructure that's existing there. And I suppose it's obviously a lot of infrastructure, a lot of discussion about where it is and ultimately priorities to achieve that and the assumptions that Kevin mentioned, but critical as of course is delivery, and how does that happen? What is the agenda to achieve that? Where are those timescales? How does that actually work in terms of that? And I suppose that's some of the key things that we see as understanding is how that can make these successful transition to these future strategic growth areas across Fife. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to meet you. It's a fantastic venue. And I think we're really fortunate to be talking about this in St Andrews. It's a cracking town, lots to aspire to there. I've got the gig, as Pam says, to talk about town centre regeneration in the context of draft NPF4. Pam alluded a little bit to my background. I've been involved in town centre regeneration for well over 20 years now, from one end of the UK to the other, all shapes and sizes and town, from small neighbourhood parades right to the central heart of London, and lots of town centres in size and in between all of that. That work's covered from policy making through to actual scheme delivery. So I've got some slides here to share some thoughts about some of my experience and some thoughts about draft NPF4. Here it is, or at least bits of it anyway. I think it's a good plan. Okay, it's still draft, and there's a final version to come out. I think it's ambitious, but set at about the right level. I think the time frame is good too, about 20 years or so. It's not too far off into the never land. It's infrastructure-led. I thoroughly support that. And in my personal view, it sets out a clear direction of travel. It sets out what I call the ambition of good growth. I think I sense that through these talks, a lot of people are going to touch on this. I think it does something which a lot of policy documents do. It starts to talk about delivery. And delivery is crucial. Policy is only going to take us so far. If I was to pick a hole in draft NPF4, I think it's still just a little bit thin on delivery. And it acknowledges there's more to come, but still, there's a lot more to come. I think that this is an interesting statement. It's been written by Sir Oliver Letwin. It's to do with England and England's housing market. It was written about 3 or 4 years ago. So all about the lack of coordination of delivering infrastructure. There's a pretty similar statement in draft NPF4. It's a UK-wide problem, this challenge of infrastructure delivery and how you coordinate it. And if I track you back to say, oh, you've got about 20 years to deliver this, actually, we need to get moving pretty damn quick on solving this problem before we can deliver all the rest. This is a challenge of draft NPF4, but it's a challenge to us all. How are we going to deliver all of this? Town centres? Well, they have their challenges too, and I think we're all familiar with them. Top right-hand image, COVID. It's absolutely whopped our high streets for the last couple of years. And then you layer on the rising rate of internet sales. And we ended up with probably the bit we like least, the visual bit. The shops closing, vacant units, tumbleweed. And then you have to layer on top of all that, the sustainability agenda, how we use our town centres, how we access them, how we reuse and repurpose buildings. But to track back to this left-hand diagram, I think it's incredible. Within 10 to 15 years, the shift from internet sales has shifted between 5 and 10%. See the COVID bit, over 30, 35%. Doesn't feel like it's going to stop anytime soon either. We're in a time where we're seeing huge structural change in our town centres. This is my very simplified guide to NPF4 and the impact of policies around town centres. There's 1 or 2 very direct policies towards town centres in a draft NPF4, town centres first. But there's a lot of side references, relevant policies. Lots. I've just picked a few out here. 20-minute neighbourhood, urban greening, decarbonisation, low carbon, distinctive places, empowerment. There's lots to go and there's lots to deliver. It's complicated, like town centres are. But at the moment, it feels a bit like this. It's all a little bit disjointed. We haven't got that nice, neat package of my Venn diagram showing how they all interrelate. This is where we need delivery plans. We need delivery plans to make sure that we can knit together the sum of the parts and make a great whole. And here's some of the things that we're being asked to deliver. Infrastructure, rail, cycleways, paths, utilities, power, community, education, medical centres, daycare centres, public realm, distinctive places, placemaking, housing, all types of tenures, from early living through to later living, families, urban greening, spaces, parks, buildings. And then we've all got to keep up with digital advances, digital savvy. There's a lot of diverse skills needed over the next 20 years to deliver it. We need delivery plans. And we need those delivery plans not just to work at a strategic level, but we also need them at that local level. We need to interrelate the two and work out how they're going to be programmed to come forward. We need to set out what I call the what, the how, the who, the when, and who's going to pay for it all. What are we going to deliver? Who's going to take the lead? How are we going to do it? How are we going to pay for it? When is it going to happen? They're all key questions. For town centres, I think we need to look towards town centre IDPs. I personally believe we need to move away from the point of seeing town centres as a collection of retail shops that make money and think of them much more about critical infrastructure that serves the communities they're meant to. I also think there are more town centre ingredients that need to make to achieve delivery. These are a couple of people I know. Andrew Lloyd and Liz Watts. Andrew Lloyd on the left, if we're struggling between the two people. They are chiefs, or were chief executives of a couple of local authorities being involved in town centre regeneration. What did they bring? They brought leadership. Leadership is crucial. They brought Project Champion, momentum, decision-making, apologies. They brought all the things absolutely needed. They brought it at a local level. Andrew got the gig to look after a local authority called Rushmore Borough Council, down south. They had two difficult towns, Farnborough and Aldershot. In Aldershot, there was a town centre site there that had been trying to be redeveloped and regenerated for over 10 years. It had been going round and round and round. Andrew got the gig, understood the importance of the site, and using his Project Champion lead and that leadership, within 3 years, he got a start on site. That leadership is crucial at a local level, but for town centres, I believe it's also crucial at a central level too. Andrew had this as well. He had vision. He knew where he wanted to get to. Andrew wanted to deliver entertainment and leisure uses into Aldershot to diversify the town centre. Vision is important. You need to take people with you. You need to create a sense of ownership and identity about where you're going. You're going to need this too. You're going to need commitment, long-term commitment. Town centres is a long-term game. It doesn't happen overnight. The scheme that I just talked about in Aldershot, so from first site selections to actual start on site was almost 13 years. That's not unusual for a strategic town centre regeneration site. And that commitment needs to go past short-term political horizons. It needs to stretch, it needs to go beyond the ups and downs. You need commitment for a long time. And we all need this, particularly at the moment. But town centres particularly need this. It's an expensive game. Repurposing, reshaping, redeveloping, it doesn't come cheap. There are pots of money out there at the moment, levelling up fund, place-based, and that's good. But personally, I'm a bit nervous that that's just a short shot in the arm. If you are thinking about town centres as critical infrastructure, they need constant feeding into that model. So where do you get that money from? Because we have limited resources, there's no doubt about it. Well, from my perspective, I'm all for a digital tax. The structural changes that have impacted on our town centre have occurred because of the rise of the internet. So I can see them feeding back as part of that. I also question whether we have significant housing developments, that they too should be contributing towards town centres, because they're supported by them, the people use them, and it would create a more sustainable development. And in part, quite often, the residential schemes are sold on the back of the quality of the town centre offer that they've got. Above all, to make town centre regeneration work, you need sustained funding, not just occasional lumps of cash chucked at a wall. To hit this point home a little bit more, this was Liz Watt's scheme. This is in Bishop Stortford. Bishop Stortford is a very affluent town. It's about 25 miles south of Cambridge, same again north of London. It's got infrastructure. It's very close to Stansted, M11. This scheme, finer grained scheme, very much focused towards placemaking, a whole mix of uses from car parking, offices, residential, care homes, arts and entertainment centre, new streets, new public realm. The value of the area, if I'm going to put it in context, is residential prices in this town are about £500, just north of £500 per square foot. I live in Stirling. I'm guessing they're about 200, 250. But even here, we needed £10 million to unlock the development of the car park to begin with. And the council's investing another 20 million into an arts and entertainment centre. Town centre regeneration of scale takes significant funding. And it isn't just the original funding, the initial capital investment. You need to think beyond it too, about the operational costs. How are you going to keep this thing running? Service charges, business cases. You need to think beyond just the delivery stage of the scheme project itself. This has been mentioned by a few people too. Your delivery plans need to address this. I talked about the diversity of skills. It's a much wider range than I started this 20 years ago, in my view. And town centres, it is resource hungry. It's money hungry, but it's also people hungry. And as part of our delivery plans, we need to understand how we're going to fill that gap. We need to do this too. It's crucial. Collaboration. Effective, positive collaboration brings out best ideas and creates a sense of ownership. And again, our delivery plans need to map this out to understand how and when, where it's going to happen, and how we take people on our journey. Go back to probably one of the common themes, coordination. The who, the what, the how, the when. Town centres require a vast range of actors to make it happen. Local authorities, businesses, landowners, developers, community. You need to pull them all together into a cohesive plan. And if we all agree that our weakness is this lack of coordination, perhaps there's a need for some kind of town centre delivery body. Somewhere where if we've got a town centre problem, we can go knock on that door and say, how do we do this? And that body can offer hands-on, direct project experience and point you in the right direction. I'm not sure Scotland's got that at the moment. It feels quite diverse where you get the answers to those questions. And through your partnerships, and through your collaboration and coordination, you should be looking to form these partnerships. I fully expect the local authorities will be a leader in town centre regeneration, but partnering up with the private sector and community groups will create something much stronger, much longer term. And it might help you fill some of that skills gap. If you do all of this and you get your delivery plans in place, you might get this well-earned drink. You'll get delivery, you'll get project delivery. And it's crucial to map out where you're going with all of this. For me, the future is bright for town centres in Scotland. I know there are lots of challenges. I'm certain we're going through huge structural change that we may never see again in our lifetime. But I do see a bright future for town centres. For me, it's kind of a back to the future, where town centres, or many town centres, are orientated towards more of a local service proposition, better serving their local community, a place to meet and greet, a place you want to go. In my view, MPF4 does set that course of direction, and that's really positive. But policy is only going to take you so far. It's about delivery. It's about the who, the what, the how, the when. It's about doing the doing. It's about creating delivery plans at a central and local level that work together. And if we can do that, if we can build solid delivery plans, I think we're a long way down the path to improving our Scottish town centres.
As Pam said, I'm part of the SGN Energy Futures team, and our role is to really look at the way in which the pipe network, so our distribution network of gas pipes, can be a vector for the decarbonisation of some really quite difficult parts of the Scottish economy, like domestic heat, transport and industry. Hydrogen's got a lot of potential, and there's going to be an awful lot of information in here that I won't be able to go into in a lot of detail because of just the sheer scale and breadth of work that we're actually doing. But I just should say it from the outset, very happy for people to get in touch with me directly after the event. I'm sure the presentations will be shared, but very happy for people to get in touch to discuss in more detail some of the projects that might be relevant to your area. Just thought I'd quickly touch on the context of some of this. As you will all be aware, we are working in two governmental administrations where there is some of the issues around energy reserved to Westminster. Other parts are in the control of the Scottish Government. There's also different sets of targets in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And this sort of sets out some of the key policy issues and the timescales. I would say that the key ones for us, and I won't go through them all in detail, is this one here. So the UK government are due to make a decision on heat policy in 2026, and that will be a decision on whether hydrogen is going to play a major role in the decarbonisation of heat, or whether it's going to be an all-electric option. We think a whole system approach needs to be taken, so it'll be a mix of the two to give the required resilience that the customers expect, that the system requires to deliver. And in Scotland, this is a really fundamental one. 1 million homes and 50,000 non-domestic buildings equivalent by 2030. Extremely ambitious target, and it's one that we're really focused on and trying to deliver within our Scottish network. And I'll touch on how we are trying to do that later on. Again, just a bit more context here. I think it's really important for people to understand just how much resilience the gas network delivers to the energy that we use as consumers and customers. This is an illustration from the Beast from the East, where that was the overall energy demand delivered by the gas network. This is the electricity supply over the same period. That peak is effectively a 1 in 20 energy event, which the gas networks are required to be designed to deliver to ensure that there's resilience of supply. So you can get a lot of energy through the gas networks quickly. You can't do that with electricity. And there's other issues around resilience as well. We all saw what happened with Storm Arwen earlier this year, and above ground power networks are extremely vulnerable to the to the likely changes that climate change is going to cause in terms of more frequent and more violent storms. It just emphasises again, I think, that we need to take a whole system approach and work as electricity network and gas network providers to deliver this resilient, sustainable future for consumers. Done a bit of work. Some of my colleagues in the stakeholder team done quite a lot of work on the customer challenge and decarbonisation of heat. Lots and lots of people want to decarbonise their homes. 73% they would replace their boiler with something greener, but only 32% say they would pay for it. And the same, I suspect the same figures would apply to heat pumps. It doesn't apply just to boilers. It's about heat pumps. It's about a decarbonisation method for your home. And we all know with the cost of living crisis and the other pressures on
people's budgets, that gap may well have increased in the last few months. So the approach we're taking within the Energy Futures team and the wider SGN business to decarbonisation is absolutely to place customers front and centre to this. We are. I should just remind people, we are the network operator. We don't produce the gas. We don't sell the gas. We just get the gas from where it's produced into to customers' homes. But we need to have a resilient network to allow customers to get the service that they expect from their gas network. I'll say a bit more about the customer piece because it's absolutely fundamental to the H100 project that Pam referenced a minute ago, and I'll say a couple of things about that. Within the Energy Futures team, we're doing a huge amount of work right now in this second item, building the hydrogen evidence base, because I mentioned the heat policy decision coming in 2026. We are, together with the other gas networks, building up a really strong body of evidence on how hydrogen can be an effective decarbonisation vector for the heat sector. So we're using, under our business plan, we've got a lot of innovation funding, and we're directing that very much at building the evidence around hydrogen and its suitability for decarbonisation. And then we're also, there's been much talk of collaboration, and it's absolutely right, and particularly when we are thinking about things as whole system. We want to collaborate with the wider energy network. We do have good relations with the electricity DNOs, for example, but we also are collaborating a great deal with industry, and particularly with local authorities. We're increasingly ramping up our discussions with key local authorities across Scotland, and actually indeed in our southern network as well. So just to canter through some of the work we're actually doing. Some of you will know about this. You Fifers will know about H100, I guess. It's a great project. It's located down at Leavenmouth in Fife. It's a world first end-to-end hydrogen supply for domestic properties. It's the final construction contracts are being awarded next month, so building of the project will start later on this year for completion in 2023. It takes power from the ORE Catapult wind turbine that sits just offshore at Methil. It puts that power into an electrolyser, which basically splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen is captured and then put into a network which will supply hydrogen, 100% hydrogen, to about 300 homes in the Leavenmouth area. And the customers will be given hydrogen-ready appliances, boilers, for nothing. It's an opt-in. The guys in the stakeholder team are already working very hard to get people to sign up, and I think that's going extremely well right now. So it's an amazing world first for the demonstration of customer acceptance of hydrogen in a domestic setting, and it's happening right here in Fife and right now. But again, this feeds into two of the themes I mentioned earlier: customer acceptance and the evidence base for hydrogen in a domestic setting for decarbonisation of heat. I should say we're also right now starting to talk to BEIS, who run the H100 programme, about the next part of their rollout, which is the hydrogen town, which is going to take the scale of hydrogen. But we think this is not as ambitious as it could be, incidentally. But anyway, the hydrogen town will supply hydrogen to 10,000 homes, and these plans should be put in place by March 2025. And we're discussing with BEIS the criteria for selection, and we do think that the Fife area could be a really, really good candidate for that town trial, building on what's happening now at H100. Very quickly, 2 LTS is a local transmission system. It's the pipe network that takes gas from the national transmission system operated by National Grid, and then takes it down into towns. It's quite big pipe, quite high pressure pipe, and it then goes into the gas network in everyone's street. we've just won £30 million to look at how the LTS could be repurposed for hydrogen. It's a really important bit of work going to inform conversion plans across Great Britain, and probably inform a lot of work done in Europe as well, actually. And that's going to be done in a piece of pipe, a redundant piece of pipe that runs from Granton in Edinburgh over to Grangemouth. Again, part of this evidence building that I mentioned earlier. And then again, this is another really important bit of work, which there's a dedicated team looking at this, and that's the feasibility for hydrogen in multi-occupancy buildings, which are a difficult one to crack. There's a lot of detailed work to be done on the safety issues and the gas management issues around using hydrogen in these multiple occupancy buildings. But it gives you an indication that we're covering an awful lot of bases and building the evidence to inform this hydrogen future and hydrogen development. And then to get on to the more strategic stuff that might have some implications for planning and consistency of delivery of NPF4. And it's a piece of work that we did about 18 months ago. It's a really major strategic assessment of the role of hydrogen in the total transformation of the gas network in Scotland, like the complete transformation and going from gas to 100% hydrogen. This was driven by the 2030 1 million homes and low carbon heat target that I mentioned earlier. It's a system reconfiguration and design that demonstrated that this could be delivered. There's a lot of bits that need to be put in place in terms of policy and regulation, including the 2026 heat policy decision that I mentioned earlier we're waiting on from the UK government. There's also some important issues around the business models for hydrogen production. So there's a lot of moving parts in this, but this was a really, really important strategic study that demonstrated that Scotland can be a really early mover to a hydrogen economy, probably one of the first in the world, actually. Driven by the production of blue hydrogen as a bridge fuel. Now, blue hydrogen is hydrogen produced from the reformation of natural gas. So you split natural gas into something like a steam methane reformer. That produces hydrogen and CO2, but crucially, you capture the CO2 from that process and take it back to geological storage in somewhere like Acorn up St Fergus in Aberdeen. But then moving very quickly to a green hydrogen future, driven particularly by the offshore wind sector, which I'll touch on a bit later, but the potential for offshore wind production in Scotland is massive. And that has all sorts of implications in supply chain, port infrastructure, export opportunities as well. And it's a massive, massive, massive opportunity for Scotland. We identified that this project could probably be best delivered in 3 phases. That's slightly changed in the last 6 months, actually. But the first phase we identified was up in Aberdeen, then second one Central Belt, third East Coast. But what we are now doing, and this is very busy, and I won't talk about all these pieces of work that we're doing, but we are now carrying out within my team in Energy Futures about 17 different projects that are about to start them that are absolutely focused on delivering the accelerated pathway that I described in the previous slide. So, I mean, the important ones out to highlight, this large-scale green hydrogen, we're looking much more closely now at green hydrogen as an accelerated opportunity for Scotland. So we've got instead of 10 gigawatts being bid for the ScotWind leasing round for offshore wind, was 25 gigawatts bid for. It's colossal potential. The Scottish electricity grid demand is about 5 gigawatts, and it's already pretty much decarbonised by predominantly onshore wind and hydro. So there's huge opportunity for offshore wind to be used and as a hydrogen production facility rather than a power production facility. Really, really important. And then we've also got some very big projects up in the north, Northern Horizons, 10 gigawatts of offshore wind to hydrogen in planning to be in place by 2030. The wind farm off the northeast of Shetland will cover an area the size of Glasgow. It's a massive project. And there's already some significant development in the south of Fife, actually. You've got a number of big offshore wind farms developing there. And some of those we think could be early movers in terms of hydrogen production as well. We're looking at the southwest of Scotland, where there's a lot of constrained onshore wind as an early opportunity to produce green hydrogen for our network. We're just about to kick off a study on that. And we're looking at green hydrogen production for some of our isolated gas grids, the so-called SIUs in Campbelltown, Oban, Stornoway, Thurso and Wick. And we've got an interesting little sideline project in Fort William, which I'll explain to people if they're interested, but I won't go into it too much now. But we're also, though, I said we're very keen to collaborate with local authorities and other stakeholders. We're carrying out a series of really important road mapping studies to develop more granularity in particular key areas on how a hydrogen economy might develop in particular areas. We're currently undertaking a study, H2 Edinburgh, which covers the Edinburgh City region growth deal area, which includes part of Fife, actually. We're about to kick off a similar study in Tayside, which covers the other part of Fife to the north. These will try to identify the key priorities for production of hydrogen and early conversion for demand of hydrogen. Where are the really key focal points for production and demand, and how our pipes can then connect. Another really important one, again, talking of collaboration and infrastructure, is this one, number 14, a water study. Water is a major issue. Folk don't really appreciate how big an issue water is, even in Scotland. Hydrogen production, both blue and green, requires a lot of water. So we're working with Scottish Water to identify where the likely locations for large-scale hydrogen production will be, how that relates to multiple water sources, potables, desalination, groundwater, final effluent from water treatment works, and try to get a joined-up approach to infrastructure development. And this piece of work hopefully will inform Scottish Water of investment priorities as a hydrogen economy emerges. And then finally, to touch on quickly, this blue box really covers the phases I mentioned earlier about the delivery of the outputs of the Reid report and how we can get this complete conversion of the Scottish network done to meet this 2030 target. We're excuse me, struggling with a bit of hay fever this morning. Yeah, so we started in Aberdeen. Now, we're not hanging around waiting for the UK government to deliver their 2026 heat policy. We're getting on with this right now because we have to, if we're going to meet the targets that we're legally obliged to meet both in Scotland and the UK. So we are now carrying out a pre-feed study for a 100% hydrogen pipeline running from St Fergus down to the city of Aberdeen. That work's going extremely well. It'll be finished by September. And it'll take blue hydrogen from Acorn. It'll also pick up some early movers in offshore wind to hydrogen, notably a demonstrator project called Dolphin down just off the coast of Aberdeen. But parallel to that, we're really getting into the detail of how we deliver this. So not only are we doing a pre-feed on what is in effect a hydrogen, the beginning of a Scottish hydrogen backbone, we're doing some work right now in how you would sectorise the whole of the city of Aberdeen, and it's, I'll be told this is the wrong figure by Barbara, but 100,000 or so connections, I think, in the city of Aberdeen. How do we sectorise the whole of the city in a way that minimises customer disruption during the switch from natural gas to hydrogen? We're doing a plant sensitivity piece of work to identify the industrial players in Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen area and how ready they might be to fuel switch to to 100% hydrogen. So we're really getting on with this and on with the detail of it. And of course, this has significant implications for the planning system, effective delivery of infrastructure. You know, that pipe goes through 2 local authority areas. They need to be on the same page and cooperate and work to the same planning processes and timescales. And then we are about to kick off. We're actually going to merge phases 2 and 3 that I mentioned earlier to phase 2A and 2B. We're going to do a similar pre-feed for the whole of the central belt and Fife and how we connect that up to Aberdeen. It's going to be a very, very significant detailed piece of work, but it'll challenge. What we're trying to do here is put projects in a place where they challenge the policy makers to reach a decision, right? You know, we can do this. You have to put the policy and the regulation in place to allow it to be done. So this is going to be really important. We're going to kick this off probably September, October time, finish it next year. The output from both these bits of work will be what we call a needs case for us to go to Ofgem for what's called a net zero reopener. It's a fancy way of saying, can you give us some more money? And we will then, at that stage, seek funding for full feed for both these pieces of work. And that is when we really get into the nitty-gritty of the planning issues, consenting, permitting, all of the stuff that is required to ensure the early stage of infrastructure delivery. And it crosses multiple local authority boundaries, as you can see. So a really important strategic piece of work that could, I hope, pretty much change the landscape and acceptance of the role of hydrogen across Scotland. And as part of this, incidentally, we are talking to a lot of plausible, credible hydrogen producers, both blue and green, which could result in very, very significant investment in industrial facilities and renewables production across that whole geography. And we do think it will also, you know, help facilitate the development of this massive industry that will be Scottish offshore wind, which will start getting deployed at real scale by 2030 or thereabouts. And just to, so I'm not accused of being parochial, we also run the networks in the south and southeast of England. We're doing quite a lot of work down there, but I find it really fascinating. Not as I'm not a gas engineer, I'm an ecologist, but I find it really fascinating getting involved in looking at the contrast between how you decarbonise the south and how you decarbonise Scotland with hydrogen. What's really, really striking, and I think it's important that we understand this, is just how utterly impoverished south and southeast of England is in energy terms. It's got virtually no indigenous energy production of its own. There's some nuclear bits and pieces. It's not quite, say, virtually none. There's some nuclear. There's a few odds and sods of renewables. But because of NIMBYism, environmental constraints, the density of population, it's really difficult to get any renewables at scale built in that area. Limited offshore wind opportunities because of shipping concerns and other environmental concerns. And also, crucially, it's short of water. I've been told that there are actually companies, particularly in the food and drink sector, wanting to move out of the south of England because they can't get enough water to maintain their processes. So water and energy is, you know, it's an impoverished area in that regard, but it's an opportunity. We're having to look at how you can get hydrogen into these networks from elsewhere. And one of the obvious locations for that, and an obvious opportunity for places like Fife, is the export of hydrogen from high-producing areas like the Scottish North Sea down into the southeast of England, because it's the only way that part of the world is going to be able to decarbonise. So there's actually a much longer list here of asks for policymakers. I've mentioned some of them. There's some of them that are complete no-brainers, and I don't know why it's not happening. This one here is crazy. All the hydrogen boiler manufacturers can produce hydrogen-ready boilers right now that can operate natural gas and can be switched over to hydrogen with a 30-minute change of burners. But the UK government, they're going to hold another consultation on mandating hydrogen-ready boilers. And it's a no-risk decision because the boiler manufacturers have said they will do it at price parity with a natural gas boiler. So we need to get some changes to what's called the gas safety management regulations to allow hydrogen to be blended. We're not talking about blending hydrogen into the gas network here, although we are thinking about it in the south, and it's worth saying that you can use your own boiler as long as it's relatively new with 20% hydrogen in the gas without having to change anything. But we need regulation to change. Again, that should be very straightforward. We need business models to be put in place to encourage and support the production of hydrogen. We want to look at the constrained renewables in Scotland as a really early opportunity to produce. At the moment, transmission-connected big wind farms have to constrain off if there's too much production and not enough demand on the grid, and they're paid a lot of money to constrain off, but they can't contractually, they can't turn that into hydrogen. They just have to accept the money, and consumers pay. Consumers pay. It's forecast that these constraint payments could get up to perhaps £3 billion by 2030. They're currently sitting at about 500 million, I think. It should be easy to change the way that the market works to deliver that. We also want to support, and actually a part of the output of our Aberdeen Vision pipeline that I mentioned earlier is to support ACON and the CCUS project up there, which was put as a reserve in track 1 of the cluster sequencing. It's a really important project for long-term carbon storage, and we want to push that decision. And as I've said, our ambition is to expedite these FEED studies that I've described to really deliver the reality of a hydrogen network in Scotland and a complete decoupling of our energy network from gas. Sorry, that was a really quick canter through an awful lot of stuff, but as I said, if anyone wants to get in touch with me to have further discussions on any of the projects that I did or did not have time to speak about, please just get in touch. Thank you.
So it's great to have everybody here at the university. It's great to host you and show off our estate. I know some of you had the opportunity to look around some of our buildings yesterday in the town, and there's a visit going to Eden campus later. So we get a chance to see what we're trying to do, what we're all about at the university and what we're trying to do. So the focus of my talk, as Pam said, was about sustainability at the university, but particularly how we create a sustainable place. I'll kind of touch on what we've done, our vision for the future, what we've already done, what we're currently doing, and what we're looking to do in the future. That's our estate vision up there, and I think there's a few colleagues in the room. We're really proud of our estate at St Andrews. As one of the world's most ancient universities, we also strive to be one of the most modern and innovative. Social responsibility and sustainability are at the heart of our strategic plan. We're committed to a programme of decarbonisation, efficient use of heat and water resources across our estate. As we develop the estate, and we do have a big programme of development, what we create must allow for flexibility and future-proofing to adapt to the fast-changing environment that the higher education sector actually is. So I thought it was worth highlighting some key facts about the university, first of all, just to give some context for the talk. We currently have around 10,000 students here in St Andrews. Our estate is spread across 5 main sites, as just we designate them. We've got the town centre, we've got the North Hall, which is where we're at, we've got Eden Campus and a couple of others. We've got just under 300,000 square metres of space across 170 buildings, so it's a large estate. It's valued at as an insurance replacement value at £1.5 billion. So it's a big investment. We are a bricks and mortar university. and we will continue to be so. Post-COVID, we've kind of made that decision. That's definitely what we are. Our heritage is a hugely important aspect of our brand and our unique selling point. For a range of buildings, from nationally important historical buildings through to state-of-the-art teaching and research facilities. In part, this is exactly what creates a sustainable place, but also what restricts our ability to make changes. So this slide shows where our carbon actually is. And while creating a sustainable place, it's much more than just carbon. The journey towards net zero is a critical part of that. This slide shows our total carbon, as I said, which is 75,000 tonnes of CO2. Of that, our estate operational carbon is about 15,000 tonnes, so it's about 20%, and then construction's another 15,000 tonnes of carbon on top of that. So it's a significant chunk of what we do. In terms of energy, the university spend around £9 million per annum on energy, and that's just a figure that's going to increase. So just quickly on this one, this is our carbon reduction roadmap. You'll see that we've set ourselves ambitious targets to reduce most of the categories which are shown in the graph on the left. In total, we're aiming to reduce our carbon emissions by around 50% and offset the rest. And I'll talk a wee bit more about that later. Some elements of this are harder to reduce than others, student travel particularly, so we do account for the carbon for that. That's very difficult for us to control. So today, I'm going to talk about what we're doing just in the estates context. So what have we done to date? One of our most recently completed projects was just unveiled the last couple of weeks by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Economy, Kate Forbes. It's a 1 megawatt solar array on ground Eden campus that you'll see later. That scheme was backed by a Scottish funding council loan and supported by the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund from the Scottish Government and from Fife Council. That one will provide electricity to the campus at Eden campus. And that installation alone will reduce the carbon footprint by approximately 5%. Our biomass district heating scheme, also down at Eden campus, been operational since 2017. It pipes hot water from a £25 million biomass plant across 23 kilometres of pipework to 48 different university buildings in St Andrews and 3,000 student bedrooms. The final point I wanted to make it was about our wind farm. So the university do have planning consent for our own 12 megawatt wind farm. We haven't built that yet. We've got a suspensive condition to satisfy in terms of the MOD and mitigation for the radar system. Trying hard, really hard to resolve that condition, and then we'll make a start on site because it's a really important part of our strategy. So this is Eden campus, and I thought it was important to touch on this in our journey towards net zero. So Eden campus is a 37-acre ex-industrial site which the university purchased in 2010. It was a working paper mill throughout the 20th century, and it really was a big blow to the economy when that closed, especially the local economy in Garbridge. So you'll see from the image that it was a really large complex of buildings, and it grew up organically, depending on the needs of the paper mill at the time. The buildings in Tickell, that's the road that runs right through the middle there, they're listed. This is Eden campus in its current status. You'll see that we've demolished large sections of buildings in the middle, and these were the ones that were really incapable of being converted. There was no identified use for how they would ever be used in the future. So we got rid of these and focused on the remainder. So it's really the ones around the perimeter. So we've kept as many as we can. So in the top left of the image is their biomass plant and the grey shed. In the bottom right, you just see the corner of Walter Bauer House, which is the home to 450 university professional staff. And that was the refurbishment of a paper store that was on the site. And the rationale behind doing that was really to free up accommodation in St Andrews, with lack of office staff down there, and allow space for growth for academic and student-facing services in the town. The solar array that I mentioned that was just opened recently is just to the left of the picture, just out of picture. And also across the site, if you see lots of areas of wild meadows and planting, which really assist with the biodiversity of that site. And the final slide on Eden campus is really showing the plans for how we expect that site to develop. Includes things like the Enterprise Hub in Orange, and that's been done in partnership with Fife Council. The main thrust behind this is about sustainability and job creation. So it's a really innovative and exciting site to be involved in. So that's what we've done. Now to kind of what we're currently doing. So more generally across the estate, we've developed an approach to creating a sustainable place. It's a sequential approach, as that graph shows, starting with optimising how we use what we have. It's captured in the estate master planning, which I'll come on to later. Once we've decided the correct size and shape of the estate, we then look to see how we can use that in the most efficient way. So our first priority really is reducing consumption through the estate use and development, building efficiency and effectiveness through retrofitting and refurbishments. That's the very first thing that we'll do. Beyond that, we'll clean up, and that's achieved through decarbonisation of our existing energy connections, and we're also investing heavily in energy storage and energy generation as well, such as our wind farm and our biomass. The remainder is the irreducible core of carbon production, which we'll then look to offset. When we talk about offsetting, we've got an initiative started to create St Andrews Forest, and we're fortunate to have the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge launch that initiative just very recently as well. We've already planted, I think, 620 trees beside our sports centre, 1,000 at Craigton Park. So we're doing this is all in partnership with local communities. We've got 12,000 trees used to form a miniature forest at Eden Campus and other locations across the estate. And there's another 950 trees that we're planting in partnership with Campbell Estate, which is a local estate to the south of the town, and also part of the Queen's Green Canopy project. There's lots of other initiatives coming forward in future years for that. So in terms of construction, we are doing a lot, we're building a lot, and that obviously comes with a carbon implication. And we do need to grow because we've got world-leading status. The university's kind of highly regarded, and we need to kind of maintain that position. So the points I wanted to make on this slide really are all enshrined in a strategy for developing the estate. So they really are promoting world-leading standards of environmental performance across our new and existing estate, really championing that and pushing it forwards. Creating biodiversity plans for our natural space alongside the built environment. And all our new developments have a really strong focus on biodiversity and natural wildlife spaces. We'll fully consider quality, sustainability and maintainability across our projects. And that'll be reinforced. We've got technical standards that we follow and governance, just to ensure that we've got repeatability and also lower through-life carbon and costs. So we recognise that our day-to-day activities for growth have a profound impact locally. The university are a dominant part of the town. And ratio-wise, the university are very big compared to the size of the town. So we really recognise that. I think part of creating a sustainable place is really engaging with our local stakeholders. So careful master planning, stakeholder engagement, kind of making sure people just are community aware, really, and that we've got discussion with planning and others are just very sensitive to what the environment that we're working in here. So we want to develop an estate in a really sympathetic, considerate manner, taking cognizance of what is a really unique and special place of St Andrews and its community, its natural environment and its global reputation. So I think if we communicate properly and transparently with our stakeholders and our partners and we listen to their ideas, we are completely willing to adapt wherever there's evidence to support different proposals and practices. So our SMART initiative, it's a slightly different topic now, but it's really important to create a sustainable place, a really important element of our future development. So Smart Campus is what we're trying to create. It will comprise intelligent buildings, which will be equipped with digital technologies, serviced by smart workplace services and capabilities to deliver real strategic outcomes. It will achieve things like improved student and staff experience through efficient, reliable, optimised and performant buildings, fit for use spaces and workplace services with real-time interactive digital capabilities and personalisation as well. Really important for students just to make them feel that they're really highly regarded and they are. We're all about students here. SMART will also help with enhancing our sustainability credentials. It will really help with energy reduction and carbon savings. We're expecting about a 10 to 20% reduction in any building that we retrofit with smart technology, which is basically sensors. A 20% reduction in carbon emissions there. And I think the final point on smart really is because we'll get a better sense of how our buildings are used on a day-to-day basis. We've got a large capital programme. This will influence what we build, where we build it, and when we build it, because we'll have a much better sense of the patterns of use within our buildings, and that's really key to what we're doing. So we've got a capital programme, hundreds of millions of pounds over the next 10 years, and just a small reduction in that can make a massive difference to the cost, because that's, we need to raise that money and find it from somewhere. So the smart technologies really do provide rich seams of new data, which we can use to influence what we do in the future. So we spoke about development frameworks, and other speakers have spoken about development frameworks too. This is an initiative that Rona, sitting across the side there, is leading on, and it's for the North Hall. So we're going to do other areas of the estate as well, but we're starting on the North Hall, which is where we're currently sitting. So this is on the western edge of the town, highly visible as a gateway to St Andrews, and it houses the largest concentration of our science faculty. That's what's really based in here, along with some student residential accommodation and also some green space. So this started off in the early 1960s. There was a master plan at that point, and the first buildings were, well, it was done by William Holford and Partners, so that means anything to anybody. Two buildings were first. It was our physics and our maths buildings, which are, I'll get the pointer to it. This one back here, and maths is right next door to it. So they were the first two buildings on site. During the 1960s, the university did expand, and to cope with that, we kind of looked to develop additional halls of residencies. And those that were on the tour yesterday would see Andrew Melville, which is across in the corner here of the North Hall. And that's a Grade A listed building now. There were plans for another 5 buildings, very similar to that one, but only the original one was ever built. So the buildings developed throughout the 60s and 70s on the North Hall, included the sports facilities, which are just so it's slightly higher up on the raised beach part of the North Hall. Got computer science, which is in here. It was just gradually developed westwards on here. Up further halls where some people stayed last night is Agnes Blackadder, so it's a large hall in here, and then we've got further plans for developing it. I think a key part of the development framework really is landscaping and urban realm. Really needs a fundamental overhaul of those that have walked about the campus. It's not something I'm particularly proud of down here. I think from a kind of pedestrian and user point of view, it's not particularly good. I think we can do better, and that's what the development framework is looking to do. So a fundamental overhaul, provide a people-centred, connective, vibrant environment for our staff, students and the community. Fundamentally, it's all about people. They're the ultimate users of the space and the buildings that are created, and are really at the heart of what we're trying to do. Successful development framework, which no pressure, will set out how to create and sustain really excellent places for living, learning, working and socialising. So the outputs of the development framework: positive step, communicate the future potential of the North Hall, and we're doing that in a coordinated way, really in partnership with the wider university, but also Fife Council are a key partner in that, and other key stakeholders. So on to another development that we're currently doing, and Andy, my other colleagues, really leading on this one, and some people have seen this yesterday. So this is our new college building. It's the first creation of a new college in the university since the foundation of United College in 1747. Really important step and transformational step for the university. Project's intended to rejuvenate and transform what is a charismatic site with a history of learning that reaches right back into the Middle Ages, and it's right in the heart of St Andrews in the town. So we purchased this in 2021, I think it was the 1st of October 2021, we took ownership of this. It was the town's former secondary school, or part of it. So it's split in two, really. The front part, so South Street is here, so the frontage is onto this street here that you'll see. So we've got an early 19th century building with neo-Jacobean frontage and a quadrangle behind it. That's outlined in blue. That's the stuff that we intend to keep. The area outlined in red stretches all the way back to Laidbrae's Walk, and that was really post-war buildings that are on that part of the site. So we've done quite an extensive options appraisal exercise for the site. And what we're now planning to do is a proposal to combine academic skills of economics, international relations and management, all in a new build in the red section, which marries up with the refurbishment of the frontage and the buildings in the blue. What this does is it makes available 3 really prime university buildings within the rest of the town that we'll repurpose. And one of these is this building here. So Gateway School of Management are in this building just now. We'll repurpose that. So university committed to retaining, restoring the 19th century listed building. And together with the development, we want to create a really outstanding result for the university, but also for the town. It's going to create a centre of excellence for research and teaching in social sciences, which is going to be second to none, and will maintain our world-leading and world-class status. So what we want to do, this is our statement here, building of outstanding quality is our aspiration, aesthetically pleasing as well as highly functional. It needs to fit sensitively into its historic setting and fully reflects the university's commitment to environmental sustainability and social responsibility. These are 2 really key pillars of what we're doing. The development, the design brief for this one, the procurement and the construction strategy around the project will strive to attain net zero carbon, which does align to the university's commitment to go carbon net zero by 2035. So just a couple of key facts for the project really are the budget, eye-watering, at £100 million for this one. And we're looking to complete this by 2027. Just one other development I thought was worth highlighting. Some people that were on the tour would have seen this yesterday as well. And I've got a couple of slides on this. So this is the refurbishment of our Younger Hall, which is our graduation venue. And what I'm particularly proud of with this one is really the quality of craftsmanship and materials that were used in a really sympathetic restoration of this building. It will allow it to become at the heart of ceremonial university life for decades to come. It's also been kitted out as a teaching venue, which increases capacity without building new accommodation, and also just brings a new life to that building rather than just being a ceremonial building. So really key part of the strategy. I thought this was really important, just to put a couple of individual images here. So the lead-covered domes, nobody will ever see this, but I think as an example of the materials and workmanship that are used and the investment that we're putting in our buildings and our estate. Our approach to things is it's about value rather than cost. I think this is really important. And that's an internal shot of the main hall, the Younger Hall. And I think so. We opened up the windows at the top there were all boarded up. I think the story was it was during the wartime. I think to stop this being a beacon, we could see the lights. But they've just been left boarded up, and just opening these windows has created, like, daylight just floods into the space now. It's a spectacular venue. First graduation on Monday or Tuesday next week, so it's testing because it's actually not finished yet. Yeah, well, it's kind of finished. So what's next for us? So don't expect anybody to read this slide. But I think what this is intended to show, this details all the different activities that we're taking as estates and across the estate to look at reducing carbon. So there's a timeline across the top over the next 15 years, or a scale on the right-hand side, which is carbon reduction. And then we've got 4 segments that detail between estate use and master planning, asset efficiency and effectiveness, energy supply infrastructure, and managing inputs. So that's what's going to keep us busy, partly busy, over the next 15 years. The colour coding shows the progress of each initiative. The green ones are complete, the yellow ones in progress, and the white ones are all needing to be done. So that's going to be busy. Some challenges. So none of this is easy, and people have touched on challenges already today. And I think our desire and our aspiration to create a sustainable place has some pretty strong headwinds, really, that we really need to counter. So the main ones from my perspective, patterns of behaviour of staff and students post-COVID, and the impact that has on the built environment, and that could be quite substantial. Strategic target of moving to net zero by 2035, only 13 years away, and we've got to balance our development and expansion plans with the need to reduce carbon. Health and safety and compliance, ever increasing legislation and guidelines, particularly the Hackett review after Grenfell, and then the Cole report as well, having a big impact on what we do at the university. And it's about trying to balance. So we've got the sustainable place, but a lot of these other things are creating a difficulty for doing that. Inflation, I think a couple of other speakers have touched on inflation, massive issue for us with a big investment plan. Adding 20, 30% onto that creates a big problem. Last couple there, infrastructure, which we've heard about. Fergus spoke to us about the gas network. We've got gas and electrical supply issues here, or capacity issues, not supply, and that's starting to influence future decisions. For example, we've just made a decision because of electrical constraints still to install gas boilers, and that's really not where we want to be or need to be. So working hard with partners across the utility companies to try and resolve that. And the final point, and I touched on it at the very beginning of the talk, is about the nature of the estate. It's a good thing and a bad thing. It sets us some challenges about how to make it sustainable. These listed buildings certainly create an interesting life to how we try to resolve the kind of balance between net zero and maintaining our built heritage. Last slide, really, just to finish on a bit of a cheerier note, is there some opportunities. I think they're really significant areas of where we can develop and realise our goals. To me, they're centred on partnership working, and that's what I really wanted to focus on. We're working really strongly and really well with Fife Council, but beyond that, utility companies and other large organisations. So the town, we've got the RNA, and we've got the Links Trust as well, both really significant players in the town. And I think we are very willing to work and to lead some of the initiatives that are on the go with all of these organisations. And I think that's really how we make a difference to what we're doing. And then just finally, so this was a slide that I stole from my boss actually at COP26. He presented this, and this is how he ended, and it was just need action, not words. So thank you for your time.
It was only last year, I think it was a £33 billion infrastructure investment plan, which the Scottish Government came out with, split across a lot of facets, which you will see in there. So, the variety that you're seeing in terms of that, in terms of transport, which Walter referred to earlier, in terms of renewable sources, in terms of the Scottish Water. I represent a few house builders, and I'm sure it'd be a different delivery of this speech if I was a house building sector representative per se. But I do believe things are getting better on that front from what I understand from colleagues at HFS. So we're talking about something that's really complex. It is really challenging. It often goes wrong. Let's face it. There are a number of horror stories, but there are some good stories too. Was not the bridge delivered on time and on budget? So it can work well and deliver at times. But £33 billion is a heck of an ambition, and I'll show some stats a bit later on new construction orders, which suggest that we are falling way short of that. And the more short we fall in terms of delivery, obviously the more we have to catch up, and you're in that vicious circle of an obstacle to getting development and planning doing what it can do to deliver sustainable development and economic growth, as well as its other responsibilities. So just some other thoughts just to add to the proposition that this is now so much more complicated than it used to be, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, where traditionally the big three would be education, would be water, would be transport. It's now so much more demand on infrastructure that's required. The Minister did refer to active travel, and obviously very big ambitions on that. Broadband, it's at the heart not just of private sector life, but I mean in terms of government, public sector services delivery, there's an overwhelming emphasis on the internet, maybe too much at times. District heat networks, you know we have to decarbonise the built environment, but these are really just at their absolute infancy across Scotland, across the UK, arguably as well. And I think are going to take a lot of leadership, and I think a lot of that is probably going to have to come from local authorities, as I suppose the ultimate authority within given areas. The private sector tends to be very fragmented in terms of ownerships. So the scale and ambitions for infrastructure now is way beyond anything that it has been, I would argue, in previous decades. But there are some more there. Just to add into it, I do see large parts of the built environment as infrastructure. You know, employers need offices where they're going to locate. Barclays needed somewhere for their new campus, and they found the sites in Glasgow, as well as the higher education support as well for the people that they needed to attract there. Deliberately put in the V&A there for Dundee. You know, a culturally led, huge, ambitious regeneration project that, in my view, rightly gets a lot of plaudits. It wouldn't have happened if left to the private sector, because the risk in it for the private sector over many years was deemed too great. Logistics, one there. So most of our retail warehousing, older industrial stock, 40+ years old. Very, very low supply of modern quality logistical space. But have we not just seen the crucial importance of logistics throughout the pandemic, throughout the shortage of materials that we're seeing at the moment, which is holding up so many of our businesses, and in terms of keeping things on the shelves and essentials flowing. So, I mean, I do like to think that we're now moving from what was a just-in-time process, huge focus really on efficiency, to just in case. But to support that, we're going to need an investment in our warehousing and our logistical stock that just hasn't been evident in recent years. There is more private investment going into that field, but it is starting from a low base. So to support much of this as well, I just wanted to throw in there the point we made in our response to the infrastructure investment plan. So if we don't have the power, the energy sources, and at the moment it feels like a lot of the emphasis is going to be on electricity in terms of supporting our future needs for heat, and you can see how important it is there. Is the national grid able to support what we want to do? I don't think it is. And I think that is going to be a vast barrier and drawback to actually delivering what we want to achieve in terms of reinventing our built environment, as well as wider infrastructure. EV points, for example, anyone? That's part of the current PDR consultation. So, obstacles to delivery. Well, £33 billion identified by the government. Quite probably, well, it is. That is a pretty cautious estimate, because another government minister stood up and said we needed 30-odd billion to retrofit our housing stock to get to EPCCs. No idea on how we're going to achieve that. So, cost, the sheer cost is an obstacle. It's a huge obstacle for the development industry. You will know better than I, in many cases, that the requirement for new education facilities will often defeat and delay a project, sometimes for years, simply because quite often the ticket price is just too high for individual developers to be able to deal with. And unfortunately, that then does come back to the public sector and maybe some innovation on how we go about that. And arguably, we'll mention them later on, but that's where bodies such as SFT, Scottish Futures Trust, can play a critical role. So cost, the sheer price of getting the infrastructure we need to make new developments, redevelopments. So new developments, I'm including redevelopments as part of that as well in my approach to that. It will, everyone knows how public sector budgets are being reduced now. Well, I think in the last couple of days, we've seen the Scottish government effectively admit that they don't have the money for what they need in terms of road and rail in particular, I think, as has been reported, and that is getting ever tighter. So innovation, I think, is going to be critical as to how we address those problems, and that collaboration was used very often in the minister's description, and no doubt it'll have to be used again. I saw how well certain little initiatives such as Spruce has worked. Talking to University of St A's a little bit earlier over lunch, Guardbridge seems to be working very well. But there are too few of these exemplar projects, if you like, that have been achieved. Spruce itself, I think about 100 million in total. The Scottish National Investment Bank around 200 million a year. It's too little. And I think we need to prioritise getting investment, especially where it's investment that's going to get a return for the public sector. Both of those, SNIB is a loan, Spruce was a loan, and will have a return for the public sector at the end of the day. It's public sector investors. So I think there's going to have to be a little bit of a loosening up and maybe a little bit more risk adopted if we're going to get the infrastructure we need to support our objectives and aims. So capacity, I'll move on to. It's not just materials that are adding to the costs in the construction sector, which I think this audience will be very familiar with. Labour as well, shortage of skills. In fact, probably even in your own profession, I think you've seen a number of people retire lately. So, some of those intangible things, the sheer experience of some of the staff that have stepped back in recent years. And as I think a gentleman said earlier in his question to the Minister, it's proving difficult to recruit and replace at this time. So we probably wasn't going to get away from a presentation from SBF, at least, if we didn't get into process and regulation. Now, I'm quite aware it's not all perfect from the private sector side of the fence. Pam's back now, but quite rightly, you pointed out to us in our conference that there's too many applications which can't be validated and need to improve it before they go forward, and that benefits nobody at all. It's a vast loss of resource from the private sector, and it takes resource and time from yourselves as well. So we understand that, and I think good collaboration and communication will help to avoid us making those kind of mistakes. And I think that's something that we can see improvement on, hopefully, working together more closely. But there nonetheless can be other frustrations in terms of the process. It's a very fragmented space. Agencies, authorities, private sector as well. And there are too many examples of where there's just been stasis, even where you might have a site. I know of one very local to where I live, earmarked for hundreds of affordable homes, because it was a brownfield site. There was a disagreement between the authority and the agency on the remediation side of that site. One authority thought it was okay, the other authority didn't and wasn't willing to put its name to it. You ended up with stasis for years, and actually the private sector builder in that particular instance eventually went bust. So nobody got anything, and it's still an empty site. And that is what we've got to try and avoid. And I don't want to be here and name names or any of that. I don't think that would be appropriate, but I'm sure you recognise the cost in opportunity that we've lost in instances such as that. Political support. for infrastructure to kickstart and be a catalyst to get the improved housing for the communities or for businesses, for that matter, is critical. We've seen the benefits of where you've seen strong leadership. You know, highlighted Dundee earlier. I'll do it again. I think there's been strong political leadership there. I realise that it's not always easy. We have a local government system that is, I think there's only 2 councils that have overall 1 political party control. So you're in a fragmented system nonetheless. I'm well aware that the professionals in this room will recommend developments, and you know, then on political whims they can be turned over, sometimes on quite extraneous reasons, and that's not your fault. That's politics. Development is a democratically regulated system in Scotland and the rest of the UK. So it's but nonetheless, where you have strong political support to drive something through, that can be key to taking along those communities referred to earlier by the minister. And I would say that is not always there, because sometimes it is easy to leap on the shock or a bad news story that will appear in the local press. And I would share what the minister said earlier. We need to up the debate on what planning can do and deliver, as well as hold it to accountability, so that we get the right development in the right place at the right time. Fully support the approach to that. So I mentioned earlier that I was going to refer just to some stats there, because if we're aiming for tens of billions of new development, then I think the total of that massed up, it's probably not easy to see. But you might argue that there's only 1 year in that whole, or 1 quarter in that whole process where you're hitting what you need to hit. It's too low. And if we're not ordering the infrastructure, we're not delivering the new infrastructure on a long-term basis like that, that goes back to January 2017, just for those at the back room, so back 5 years at this stage. And infrastructure is in the yellow band in the middle there, just for those at the back. I think that shows you that we're failing to hit our targets on a pretty frequent and consistent basis, unfortunately. And that's why I think we need to see an urgent new way forward. So funding, inevitably, often it comes back to this. It's not just about funding. I think, as I hoped to argue earlier, it's also about leadership. Levy Section 75, some analysis done for the government a few years ago when it was looking at infrastructure levies and so on. Private sector, I think, is only ever likely to be a small part of this pie in a direct sense, unfortunately. And that's why, given the constraints on public budgets, I think, and I will argue later on, innovation is needed. Long-term patient capital, the legal and generals and ilks and other companies of that ilk, yes, I think have been very proactive, but they're obviously been proactive across the UK. So you are in competition, whether you like it or not, with other parts of the UK. And yes, they also need some good incentives and revenue streams to support their own obligations to the pension fund holders and the like. Infrastructure levy, interesting, also subject to a sunset clause, so I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that in the next year or two. I find it interesting that, I guess, the obvious comparator, SIL, is itself under review in England, and I would argue has had some pretty mixed feedback, I would say, across the board. Capacity, we referred to this earlier, so I won't overdo it again, but I think some of those investments in people and setting the infrastructure for the kind of built environments which you want to see in the future are going to be critical to delivering our future communities. Infrastructure-led approach. Well, I'll name and shame you, Craig. I think you said at our conference last week that this is often mooted but rarely ever defined, and I think you're quite right. Obviously, there's some examples which most people could think about of where you see development go along corridors of rail improvements and the like, or station improvements, and that's quite straightforward in its way, but doesn't come along too often. It is probably the point in that. I think there is a lot more work going on in trying to align plans and utility companies' future investments and so on. And yes, we need to see more of that come together. I think again that was alluded to in the question on government policies. You know, Housing 2040, the capital expenditure plan, infrastructure investment plan, MPF4 when it comes back, and so on. So I think our view at the SPF is we felt initially there was the potential benefit in a national infrastructure agency of some sort. The independent planning review from a few years ago, that was one of the things that come up with at the time, as people may remember. I think we saw it that it had the potential to be a ringmaster and bring the parties together, and that, you know, just helped to break deadlocks at times. And you know, we do know obviously that the likes of SFT have played that role at times where certain large-scale developments or mixed-use developments have come to an impasse between agencies, between government, and so on. So we think there's something there still that maybe needs building on. And as you'd have it in the programme for government, there was the National Infrastructure Company proposal, in very loosely referred to work to look at it. As we say there, we don't really know the detail of that. What's the timetable for it? What will it have? What oomph will it have, if any? Is it just the Scottish Futures Trust? I don't know. Open question, really. What is the intentions behind its role? Is it the broker role? Is it trying to take control of a plan? How will that work? How will it work with sets of authorities on a regional basis? Obviously, strategic development plans having fallen to the side in a statutory sense. So, you know, I think there's still a huge number of questions there about how the infrastructure framework is going to be created from now after 2019. And for me, I'd say there's still far more questions than answers as part of that process. And I guess the concern for us is that, as I said to the Minister, we do really want to see the planning system as a platform for investment into Scotland, which is often competing for investment on a global basis. It's not just within Scotland or the wider UK. So I'll end on that note.
Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies from Karen, by the way. She's got a 5 o'clock deadline. She would much prefer to be here because it's one of those that's hideous what she's trying to get through. So yes, Brownfield land, and picking up on the delivery theme, as has been mentioned, that's what we want to see. It's the archetypal crane count that some of the surveyors do, just as that mark of the construction activity, again, that David was touching on. That's kind of what we want as well. That's the happy developer. Not sure if there is such a thing. We can maybe ask David about his members later as to whether any of them are actually happy. But getting on to the real meat of it, is it allocate and they will come? That is, of course, a rhetorical question. I know you all know it's not that straightforward, but it was really just to pick up on some of the issues underlying that. And I thought it was worth starting with what is now going to be the 10-year plan cycle, because I see that as a real practical problem. We have had an enormous period of change the last few years. Hopefully, we're never going to see anything like the last few years ever again. But even in the quieter times, a lot can change in 10 years. A lot can change in property in 10 years. Certainly, that has been a theme throughout my career. And you'll all have seen it as planners, that we go through waves of a new form of business activity. And we all grapple with what that means. I was reminiscing about, I can't now remember what the problem was, but a while back we were all talking about tanning salons and oh, what use class do they fit in? And you know, internet cafes. Anyone remember internet cafes? Again, that had planners scratching their heads. Now, that's just the common theme there. So I thought it was worth just putting that up there as a thought, that allocating, thinking ahead through a 10-year period, or you're possibly projecting longer, it's really hard. Inevitably, the main issue is it's going to be market-led. I'm not going to get into a big discussion on funding. Other people have touched on it. But primarily, to make anything happen, if you allocate and the market doesn't like it, it's not going to happen. And it'll just sit there. You need a willing landowner, unless you're prepared to walk in with CPO powers. And the problem with landowners is sometimes they think they can make more money by holding out for a different use. And I've seen clients trying to do site assembly where they've eventually walked away because one of the landowners was just asking for too much. It does happen. It is a reality. So you need to be aware of that. You need the willing developer, the developer who's actually going to make it happen, invest the time, the money to push it forward. I've mentioned there on the slide, it's quite important in the urban context, which is primarily where brownfield development is going to be. Mixed use development is harder to make happen. For instance, if you've got a site where you're going to have some offices and some resi, those are two very different forms of property. They have very different issues in terms of market, occupiers. The developer quite often will not be developing the whole site. They will be looking to pass it on to the people who know those particular markets best. That has a real delivery issue. And I'll come back to that, I think, later on. And there's the whole issue of the finance and the viability. The planning consent has got to be fundable, is the sort of buzzword that we use. And the problem there is things like phasing restrictions. Those can cause problems when it comes to the due diligence that funders do. And that, again, is something that I've become more and more aware of through the years. Because I get brought in as a planning lawyer, look at this planning consent, tell us what it actually means. And that's where the mixed use example, it's quite important that if someone's looking to do the office bit of the development, they do not want to have to be bogged down with what's happening on the resi bit of it. They want to be able to push on. But if the phasing restrictions mean they can't do that, they may well say, I just can't fund this because no investor is going to give me the money because of the uncertainty created by that phasing restriction. So again, it's where planning has to understand the realities of what the developer is looking to do, rather than just saying, well, this is the vision we have, and of course we need this phasing restriction. I thought it was useful to just try and set out some of the challenges and the opportunities of brownfield. Now, I'm sure you can instantly look at that and go, Yeah, but not every site. And Greenfield isn't necessarily easy, but it was just a start to get you thinking a bit. I'm not going to go through them all because a lot of them are fairly obvious, but I wanted to pick up on just a few. And actually, just as an aside, it was interesting. I thought, I don't want to make a fool of myself. And I spoke to one of the conveyancing partners just to see if there was anything that I'd got wrong or missed anything. The good news is I hadn't. He'd given me a few extra thoughts. But he said, oh, you know what? I don't do any resi, so all the work I do is brownfield. And I just thought that was a really interesting thought, that we keep talking about prioritising brownfield development as though it's something new, as though it's not happening all that much. And yet you've got someone there who's in effect saying, that's what I do all the time, and that's what he's been doing all the time, all the way through his career. So it is a reality, it happens. Maybe we need to make more of it happen. But there's a lot of experience out there. So just picking up on a few of them. The site assembly ransom strips. What my colleague also mentioned was if you have an urban site, you can sometimes have problems about diverting utilities that run through the site if you're going to be doing piling and stuff. And again, you might also have that in a greenfield site. You could have a high pressure gas pipeline. I've come across that before, but it's a bit more prevalent in urban areas. Design envelope. What I was meaning there was, again, in your urban sort of scenario, you might have a listed building. It might be in a conservation area. You've got to think about daylighting and privacy for adjoining uses. Character and appearance of the area might be more of an issue, whereas greenfield tends to be urban periphery, so it's maybe not such a big deal. The height of the buildings becomes a big factor. So you've got all of those issues which make it more of a challenge to develop the site and actually deliver it. Agent of change. I'm getting really used to talking about agent of change. It used to be called compatibility with existing uses. It picks up maybe a bit on what David was talking about introducing PDR for resi in town centres. In theory, yes, it's something we all want to see, but agent of change can be a bit of an issue. There are some other things, and that's for a separate discussion. But the thing with agent of change, and particularly looking at noise and smell, that's where environmental health colleagues can be a real pain in the neck because they're just too rigid. And I'm saying that from painful experience. And again, like others, I'm not going to go into details. I'm going to keep it completely anonymous. But there is an issue there. And it's something that we've got to be aware. And again, I'll come back to that kind of later. In terms of the advantages, and again, I flagged up on the slide, is advantages bracket maybe or maybe not. Yes, services can be available, but as my colleague pointed out, power is more and more of an issue these days. And some sites get torpedoed because it's just going to cost too much to upgrade the power supply. And it can be sometimes there is an existing supply, but it's just when you go and do the investigation, you discover it needs a new substation down the road or further back in the network, and it just torpedoes it. The other one I wanted to pick up on is kind of under road infrastructure that my colleague mentioned. It's don't make the mistake because the site has an existing access that means everything is all right, because it could be on a servitude that only allows limited access. And that when you actually get a lawyer to look at it, they say, oh, well, you're either not going to be able to use that access because you can't upgrade it, put more traffic on it, or you're going to have to do a deal. So again, it's just making sure that you think things through and do a bit of investigation rather than jumping to conclusions. So that was just a bit of a rattle through some of the issues that might be involved. What can the planning authority do or do better? I should say, when Karen looked at the slide, she said, you've got to say something about what the Scottish Government can do. I've not, because to be honest, the Scottish Government stuff is either into the funding, which, as I said, I'm not dealing with, or it's policy stuff, which wasn't practical enough for me. So I've just ignored them. I've ignored politicians, I've ignored communities. So I'm not being inconsistent, I'm ignoring a lot. I was only given about 20, 25 minutes, to be fair. So what can the Planning Authority do? And don't worry, it's not just the Planning Authority. Others will be pointed to in a minute. On the plan-making side of things, we're focused on delivery, bit obvious. But that was why Pam asked me to speak. So, fulfilled, tick that box. Regular reviews, again, going back to the 10-year plan cycle, I'm sceptical that you'll have the resources to do much in the way of regular reviews, but I'll put it out there as a thought. Being tougher on deallocating the bed blockers as they've been known. This has been a discussion forever, and there seems to be a sort of nervousness. Oh, well, we can't really do that. Well, why not? You have the power. The procedures are there. Just get on with it. Unless, of course, it's my client's site. And then the more detailed sort of stuff, it's more the development management stuff. Does every site have to tick every box in terms of the policy objectives? Because there's a feeling sometimes it's a bit like that. So it's just thinking about, well, what are your priorities? Because if you want all the boxes ticked, it's going to bog things down and it's going to take longer. Whereas if you want to fulfill a housing target or something, maybe it's good just to get on with it and compromise on something else. Giving some projects some priority in terms of your officer time. I'm frustrated so often when we're deep in negotiations to be then told, oh, the lawyers aren't going to be available for another 2 weeks because they're busy on other things. It's sort of, oh, what, really? You know, can we not just get some prioritization going to make things happen? Because you're a bit skeptical that the other things are actually particularly important. Maybe they are. But just trying to think about that a bit. Having an awareness of the width of legal powers. So often it's, we don't do that. Well, why not? It's not a standard condition. So what? The power to impose conditions is potentially so wide. And I think there's an inherent cautiousness, and whether it's a lack of awareness, but so many calls I get from developers, it's the officer isn't sure they can do that. The officer thinks they can't do that. Could we do this? So it's just having that sort of can-do attitude of, if we're not sure, let's just ask and find out. Or indeed, as so often happens, as the developer's lawyer, I'm asked to inform the planning officer. So the planning officer, in effect, gets free advice because the developer's paying me. As part of that, actually, it's pushing your council legal as well to adopt that can-do. In the private sector, we get that all the time. Tell me how we can do it, Neil, because that's what people are interested in. So often when we're negotiating things with council lawyers, it's that we can't do that, we don't do that. Right, well, are we trying to make this happen or aren't we? So it's just trying to get over that. And so, you know, push your lawyers. They are not God. I regard myself as a service industry. I am not offended if someone says, I hear you, Neil, but I'm not going to do that. It's sort of fine. I've told you. If you want to go a different way, that's fine. I'm not offended. As part of that, it's about accepting that you can't de-risk absolutely everything. We find this sometimes negotiating Section 75. The heads of terms have been agreed, and then it gets bogged down because the council team are really worried that there's a bit of a risk that this might not happen quite the way it's supposed to, or what about this? Developers are used to accepting that you can't de-risk everything. it's about assessing risk and getting on with it. And I think, again, it's trying to encourage the planning profession, but also the legal advisors, to just have a bit of confidence. You're there to make things happen. You're not there to say, oh, I'm not sure if we can do this. It might go wrong. The reality is, as we all know, every planning permission that is granted, that scheme is never built out the way it's in the planning permission. It always changes. Whether it's a non-material variation or more of a variation, things change. Everything is different. There's risks all the way through. That's just the reality. Getting cooperation from the other departments, my environmental health example. Too often, developers are told, oh, the consultee response says, in effect, no. Well, that's just not good enough. The planning officer needs to take some ownership for actually getting some collaboration going to turn that no into a, how are we going to do it? And there's too much of the silo mentality still. The planners need to be the championing of, particularly if it's an allocated site, is actually, right, what can we do to get this through? And as I said, in fairness, I'm not going to pick on developers, planning authorities all the time. As David said, he had already said before, developers aren't blameless. There are some good developers, there are some bad developers. So developers could front load more. There is still too much of an attitude of, I'll not spend the money on doing some design work or investigating this, that, and the next thing until I'm really sure, or until I'm told I've got to. Really, I suppose it's going back to the slide about the challenges and the advantages and the disadvantages. The more information you have about a site, the more insight you've got into the likelihood of a problem. So developers getting stuck in earlier, but we do have to recognise that they're taking a risk on that, because if they do more work and they don't get a planning permission, it's all wasted. So it's achieving that balance and just an openness and realism as well. And again, you know, some developers are quite good at that, others less so. But it comes to the collaboration, which is the theme that we've been talking about. So just to kind of tie all of that together, the opportunity of brownfield development isn't a new thing. We've been doing it for ages. It is important to understand the potential difficulties. Yeah, greenfield is not completely simple, but greenfield is easier. Brownfield is more challenging, and some of the sites really challenging. And delivery requires the collaboration that we've all been mentioning and some compromise on all sides. And I think, you know, a lot of developers, a lot of planning authorities have got quite good at that, but there's just scope for doing that bit of it better. And those were the kind of initial thoughts I had around the delivery theme. So I'll just stop there.